Welcome back to our channel, and I thank you once again for joining us. For those of you who know me personally or have come to know me through these videos, you're going to know that I prefer logic, reason, and actual documentable facts. I don't go for jumping up on soapboxes and screaming, and I know that there are people and organizations and, in fact, government agencies that sort of wander around the forest looking at butterflies and just grabbing their facts out of thin air. And then they try to feed these facts to us. That doesn't work for me. I want actual facts. Now, I'm going to use these actual facts to answer a question that I think begs answer. Over the past 40 years, there have been just a truckload of restrictions placed on the freedoms of sex offenders, and I'm talking about sex offenders who are finished with their probation and parole, who are just finished with court-ordered sanctions, and yet they have restrictions placed on their freedoms that are not placed on any other type of criminal. For instance, those who murder children, when they're done with their parole and probation, they can go on and do what they want, live where they want, work where they want, nobody really pays attention. Those who break into the homes of children to, I don't know, watch them while they're sleeping, and I'm sure there are some sickos out there that do that, there are no restrictions placed on their freedoms after they're completed with their court-ordered sanctions. So I want to know, do these laws restricting the offenses, sex offenders actually make the world safer? Are there fewer sex offenses being committed because of this? Now, I don't have to make up facts and figures, and I don't have to make up arguments, and I don't have to jump up on a soapbox, because these facts and figures are available to us right now. So what I would like to do is take the crime rates that are provided to us by these reports and compare them. We'll look at different types of violent crimes, robbery, murder, what have you. We'll then look at the general violent crime rate, and we will compare that finally to the rate of sex offenses. Because if these restrictions on the privacy and the personal lives and the freedoms of sex offenders actually reduce the crime rate, we should be able to see a dramatic decrease as compared to all other crimes for which there are no restrictions on the freedoms of these felons. So it seems to me like this is a really simple test. So let's jump into it. The first case I would like us to consider is that of Jenny Rios Martinez, an 11-year-old boy who lived near the beach in Central Florida. When he was 11 years old, he was lured away from a ball field and taken to a motel by a family friend, who then bound the boy with duct tape, his hands and his feet. He then cut the boy's clothes away and began raping him. When the boy kept crying out from the pain, this man, well, I use the term man loosely, this person put duct tape over the boy's mouth and nose so that he couldn't scream, and so this boy ended up suffocating to death while being raped. As a result of the very justifiable outcry against this crime, the Florida legislature passed the Jenny Rios Martinez Act, which mandated that sex offenders would serve more of their prison time than anyone else. Now, I need to point out that this crime involved 3 elements: kidnapping, rape, and murder. But the law that was passed in his name only dealt with sex offenses. It had nothing whatsoever to say about the fact that he was kidnapped or murdered. Let that be the starting point for this conversation. The next case I would like us to consider is that of Jacob Wetterling. When Jacob was 11 years old, he was playing with some friends in a field in Minnesota near his home when the boys were confronted by a man with a gun. This man chased the friends away and dragged Jacob into a copse of trees where he forcibly raped the boy. When he was finished raping the boy, he took a gun to the back of the boy's head and shot him. He then disposed of the body by burying it in that copse of trees. Just like with the other case, there was a great deal of public outcry, very justifiable. So the United States Congress passed the Jacob Wetterling Act. This was the first law of its kind that required a compilation of the names of sex offenders. In essence, it was the very first sex offender registry. But just like the first case, I'd like to point out that there were three elements to this case that need to be considered: kidnapping, rape, and murder. And yet, when the United States Congress passed this law, the law named after this boy, the law dealt only with sex offenders. It wasn't concerned with the fact that the boy was kidnapped, and it didn't seem all that concerned with the fact that the boy was murdered. So apparently those elements just aren't as important as the fact that the boy was raped. For this third case, we need to head back to Florida. We're going to go down toward Miami on the western side of the city, right where the city meets the swamps. Interestingly enough, I happen to grow up in this area. And this is the case of Jimmy Rice. Jimmy was 9 years old when he got off of a school bus in the western part of the county and was walking home when he was confronted by a man, again, with a pistol. This man forced Jimmy into a pickup truck, drove him to a trailer in an isolated avocado grove, and then raped the boy. When he was finished raping the boy, he used that .38 pistol to shoot Jimmy in the chest and killed him. But the atrocity that he committed against this child didn't end there. As much as you might think that that's the end of it, it isn't. This man, and again we're using the term man very loosely, this man then used a bush hook to cut Jimmy's body into pieces and then tried to hide those body pieces inside of concrete planters. Now, I didn't know what a bush hook was when I read this case, and so I had to look it up on the internet, and maybe you don't know what a bush hook is either, so I'm going to put an image here. This is the tool that was used to cut this boy, to hack this boy into pieces. There was, again, just like the others, there was a justifiable outcry from the public condemning these atrocities. And so the Florida legislature passed the Jimmy Rice Act. What this law did was allowed courts to hold sex offenders basically in prison beyond the end of their prison sentence. So let's say a sex offender had a 5-year prison sentence and the state didn't want to let him go. They can use this law to hold that sex offender really for the rest of their lives. They can make it a 30, 40, 50-year sentence by sidestepping the criminal court. Now, I need to point out that Jimmy's case, just like the others, involved three elements: kidnapping, rape, and murder. But the law passed in this boy's name had only to deal with sex offense, had nothing to say about kidnapping or murder. So once again, the legislature is telling us that people who kidnap children or people who murder children are not as dangerous as those who sexually assault children. I'm sure you see the pattern developing here. We're going to remain in Florida for a moment because Florida apparently is a repository for crazy people. And we're going to talk about the case of Jessica Lunsford. Jessica was 9 years old when she was snatched out of her home by a neighbor. She was taken to that neighbor's home and confined in his closet over a period of time. During that period of time, he sexually assaulted her repeatedly. When he was finished with her, he then convinced her to climb inside of a plastic garbage bag, which he tied up, and then buried that plastic garbage bag underneath his porch, which, yes, means that this terrified, frightened, and abused girl suffered a horrific death buried in a bag underneath a porch, underneath dirt. There was, as you can imagine, and as is appropriate, a great deal of public outcry. As a result, the legislature in Florida passed the Jessica Lunsford Act. This law required sex offenders to have stricter registration requirements, stricter penalties for violating those registration requirements, and required certain sex offenders to wear GPS monitors on probation and parole. Just like with the other three cases we just talked about, there were three elements to this case: kidnapping, rape, and murder. And just like the other three cases, the law passed in the name of this young girl has only to do with sex offenders. It has nothing to say about those who kidnap children or those who murder children. By now, the pattern should be crystal clear to you. Now that we see what's really going on, let's look at just one more case. Let's put the icing on top of the cake. Let's leave Florida and let's go to New Jersey and let's look at the case of Megan Conca. Now, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her last name properly. If I'm mispronouncing it, that is not intentional, and my apologies to her memory and her family. But this is another case where a young girl was lured into a home, sexually assaulted, and then the person who did these things to her wrapped a belt around her neck and tightened it until she was dead. Because of the very justifiable, as with all the other cases, public outcry, there were 2 laws passed in her name. This young lady got 2 laws. The first was Megan's Law. This law required that the information gathered about sex offenders had to be published so that the public could become aware that sex offenders were living in their neighborhood. The second law, which was rather recent, is the International Megan's Law. This law requires sex offenders who have passports to turn their passports in order to have their passports stamped as sex offenders. So no matter where they go on the planet, they must identify themselves to the country they're entering as a convicted sex offender. Now, with all of the other cases we discussed, there were 3 elements here. There was kidnapping by luring her into the home, rape, and murder. But both laws passed in her name completely ignored kidnapping and murder and focused only on sex offenders. Now, at this point, I don't think there can really be any reasonable argument that these laws are exploiting the children who they're named after. Putting aside any possible agenda by the legislatures for passing these laws, let's look at the real application. Let's look to see if these laws really do affect the rate of sex offenses in the United States. When I did my homework, I looked for 4 sources of information that were publishing crime reports because I didn't want anybody to say that I was just pulling facts and figures out of thin air. I went to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, which issues crime reports every year. I looked at the Florida Department of Corrections crime reports, and they keep track of the numbers of people coming to prison for certain offenses and how many people come back to prison for committing those same offenses again. There was also a report paid for by the Pew Charitable Trust that was conducted by the University of Texas and Florida State University. Now, most of these sources dealt specifically with the crime rates in Florida. The Pew Charitable Trust report had to do with the entire nation. But for what I'm going to say, I am really specifically speaking to the crime rate in Florida because that's the one I'm most familiar with. What I'd like you to look at first is the rate of murders in Florida. If you look at this graph, you're going to see that there was a spike in the 1980s and then a general trend downward for the next 30, pushing 40 years. And you're going to see that we are now in 2019 at a 40-year low for murders. Let's next look at burglary. You're going to see basically the same trend. You're going to see a spike in the 80s and a general trend downward for the next 30 to 40 years to the point that we are now at a 40-year low. Let's extend that further, and now let's look at robberies. Here you're going to see yet again the exact same trend. You're going to see a spike in the 80s with a general trend downward to where today we're at a 40-year low. Now, these are very important because what these show us is that there was a downward trend in the crime rate when there were absolutely no laws, not one, zero laws enacted to restrict the freedom of murderers, of burglars, of robbers. There were no stiffer penalties placed on these people as a result of them being specifically murderers or specifically robbers. There is no national registry. There is no state registry. There is no registry for robbers, burglars, and murderers. And yet, the trend went downward. Robbers, burglars, and murderers are not prevented from living near schools, from living near beaches, from living near public theaters. And yet, the trend went down. So let's look at the overall crime rate for Florida. And boom, here you go. It's the exact same trend. And this was accomplished with no specific legislative action. There was no Get Tough on Murderers campaign. There was no Get Tough on Burglars campaign. Let's keep that in mind for a second, because now we're going to look at the sex offense rate. And here you go. It is the exact same trend. There was a spike in the 80s and a downward trend to where right now we're at a 40-year low. So if the sex offense rate matches the overall total crime rate, can we say that there was really any effect whatsoever with the passage of these laws? Can we say that there was any kind of influence, that there was any kind of success with these laws? Now, of course, that depends on how we're defining success. If you're defining success by the fact that politicians got votes, then yes, okay, it was a success. If you're talking about success because we get a certain thrill as a society over beating the heads of sex offenders, okay, I guess that was a success. But if we're talking about a reduction of crimes directly related to these laws, that's a fallacy, that is a fantasy. It's just not true. In thanking you for joining us today by watching this video and spending a few minutes, let me remind you that you are welcome to send your comments and your thoughts and your ideas to us. When we can, we respond, but we always read them. So hopefully this gave you something to think about, and hopefully I'll see you again in the next video. So until the next time, I send my greetings from Southern Germany. Tschüss!